Today is Monday, May 10th, and my name is Brandon Springer. I'm interviewing Dr. Robert Baxt, who is a dentist that worked with the new American immigrants brought over by Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry. This interview is being recorded for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program by myself, and Ren Sherling is also observing the interview. So Dr. Baxt, Bob.
Thank you.
When and where were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, in March 7th, 1947.
And tell me a little about growing up in Brooklyn, where you went to school.
Those were some great days in Brooklyn. I went to the public school system and went to Lafayette High School. And as I've thought about recently, those were some golden years in New York City public school education system, and I was surrounded by a lot of bright kids in those days, and most of them were Jewish in our school, and those that were not were Italian. We had, I think, about one black kid in our school. The ethnic diversity was rather limited in those days where I grew up, in part of Brooklyn.
And you're Jewish?
I am Jewish. I grew up in an Orthodox home, yes.
And so what did being Jewish mean to you growing up in Brooklyn?
It was a way of life then. You know, we were surrounded by a lot of other Orthodox people, but it was a period where, you know, my parents grew up, we did grow up in a kosher home, but it was the period where non-Jewish habits were being introduced into Jewish life via Chinese food and shrimp were slowly being snuck in at night in the cover of darkness on a Sunday. So
the infamous Chinese food rule.
Right. So but you know, when I went to synagogue in those days, you walked to synagogue, you didn't drive, and Jewish women sat in the back in my synagogue. When I was bar mitzvahed and finished reading my portion of the Torah and went to go and hug my mother, I had to walk all the way up the aisle and go into the back half of the synagogue, you know, the forbidden area for men, and at which point the rabbi yelled at me, "Get back up here!" You know. Anyway, that was that was a great era in Brooklyn. You know, Ebbets Field was gone, but it was still a great era in Brooklyn.
And so I guess you identified religiously as Jewish.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Now, after high school, what was your trajectory? Where did you go?
I skipped a lot of years in school. I graduated high school when I was 16, and then went to actually Long Island University in Brooklyn and spent 3 years there, and went to summer school every year, and so wound up getting into dental school at 19. So I skipped a lot of years in my youth, and went to New York University Dental School in Manhattan, which was the first time I lived away from home. I lived at home when I went to college. Not the true college experience, but...
And then once you graduated, what was next?
After dental school, I graduated in 1970, did an internship for a year in Brooklyn Heights at Long Island College Hospital, and then traveled our country for 6 months and got to see the United States. Shortly after that, opened a practice in Vermont, stayed there for 3 years, and realized the limitations that country life in Vermont could provide for a city boy, and subsequently traveled around again, found Boulder, and moved to Boulder in 1975.
And did you open a practice here?
I opened a practice in 1978. Yeah. I got to enjoy life in Boulder for a while, and actually worked on a landscape crew for a while, making $2.50 an hour. But I was voted best laborer, so I got to $2.75.
There you go. And how did you encounter the Jewish life in Boulder at the time?
You know, it was a period in my life when I had pretty much left the practice of Judaism, because in Vermont there wasn't any practice. I didn't observe a whole lot in Vermont in those years, in 72 through 75. And in 75 here I did discover Har Hashem, and did start going a bit. It was a small synagogue in those days, and did start going again on the high holy days, but that was the extent of it, of my Jewish life here. In fact, I mean, I met a non-Jewish woman, and she and I got married in the early 80s, but I had met her before that, but she was the one who actually started reintroducing me to Judaism, because she started taking conversion classes. So,
Pause.
sorry, that was... So, I slowly got back into Judaism.
Mm-hmm. Now, Har Hashem is a Reform congregation, correct?
Indeed.
And so how is that sort of transitioning from an Orthodox...
Not easy.
No?
Not
Why not?
easy. Well, besides the fact that everything, for the most part, was done in English in those days. And maybe more so because the rabbi in that period in Boulder was a rabbi who, in being kind, lacked charisma. And in not being kind, was not a very pleasant person, and did not make services, a welcoming experience or a meaningful experience. Mm. So, but the thing from Reform, remember, I had pretty much left Judaism, so getting back to it on any level was, more than I had been practicing, more than I had experienced. And the mere fact that my wife was doing it, this was all new to her. Going into an Orthodox situation would have been a very difficult transition for her as a Catholic lady.
Yeah. But then, even though you hadn't been practicing, did you still identify as a Jew?
Absolutely. That I do.
And then, at that point, what had made you Jewish if you weren't practicing?
In my mind, Judaism is strictly based around, for me, based around family and based around traditions. And although I may not have observed the traditions, I knew most of them. I still honored them in my way. But I think once one is a Jew, for me, I don't think that it leaves you in that sense.
Mm. So
God is not necessarily a part of it for me, though.
So in Boulder, when did you first come into contact with the Cohens?
Oh gosh, probably in the synagogue, back in the late 70s. Mm-hmm. And then I think they did some wills and such for us, some legal work. Mm-hmm. So, it was a relatively smaller community back in those days. And so you would see others. Sarah Jane was one of those people who, when at synagogue, you knew she was there because she had a lovely voice and belted out every prayer in a very soprano-ish tone. Mm-hmm. So that's how I sort of started meeting them, and knew others who knew them.
Mm-hmm. Such as?
Gail Laurie, and my wife worked with her in the brokerage business, and there were, so that, and Midge Korzak, I think, is friends with them. My good friend who just happened to want to have contacted me is friends with them too, so Randy Hartman.
And then, when did you first get involved with Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry?
As I recall, in the late 80s, I got a call from Bill Cohen saying that he was going to be working on bringing some people over from Russia, and could I create, or in some manner, some sort of dental program to, and we didn't know at that point to what extent, or how the program would look and act, but to do something to see these people and see if we could accommodate some or all of their dental needs.
Mm-hmm. And what was your reason of interest in getting involved once he called you?
What was my interest?
Yeah.
Humanitarian.
Mm-hmm.
I always believe you try and help people who are in pain, or we don't do everything for money. That's not always the main motivation. Yeah, I guess that would have been it. It was.
Had you been involved in any sort of activist work before Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry?
Activist work, protesting wars.
Tell us about that.
Getting gassed in Washington, 1969, 70, protesting the Vietnam War.
Mm. Anything else?
Growing mustaches in dental school when you were not supposed to have them. I didn't get as far as growing payas, but I did have a ponytail. But that was the extent of my activism in my youth.
So, back to BASJ. So what was, once Bill called you, and what was sort of your role? What were you doing?
Well, I mean, what form did the program take? Because, I can't recall how many people started coming in. I want to say there would be 4, 5, 6 at a time, that he would start giving me some names, or I think then the people started calling. Mm-hmm. But our role was, what we decided to do was to be a MASH unit, and what we would do is bring the people in at our lunch hour. And as I recall, it was once a week, and my staff would just stay at lunch. Maybe I would bring in some food for them, and we would bring in the people, take films, do limited exams on them, have their teeth cleaned by my hygienist staff. And then what we started to do was to farm them out to other dentists who I had contacted to see, who would take these people on a pro bono basis. I did say to those dentists that if there was extensive work, what all I expected the dentists to do, or to try and do, was to limit pain. If there was any other work that needed to be done, i.e. crowns or something, on a more costly basis, they could make arrangements with the patients. We did have a dental lab that, actually another Jewish fellow, his name was Bob Corwin, or is Bob Corwin, that he would do some of the crowns, the more costly work. He would do that on a pro bono basis as well. But we tried to limit that. I mean, we weren't there to do thousands and thousands of dollars worth of work. What we were trying to do was stabilize these people's mouths and give them a little education, how to take care of their teeth.
And how much of that education did they need?
There was a different mindset in Russia, and there was a fair bit of education that was needed. Whether it all took initially, I don't know, but they did need a fair bit of education. I don't recall, that they all had toothbrushes that they used several times a day. My suspicion is that they did not.
Do you remember any of the new Americans ever being surprised by some of the things that you were telling them?
That's not one of the things I just generally recall. They came over with a different value system in the sense that, we see in different areas of the country now, you see some people who might have gold front teeth, and they see that as a symbolic way of them representing, that they've made it in life. And that happened to be, I use that example because that's one of the things that you saw in Russian dentition, the work that was done there. You would see some gold teeth in the front of their mouth. Well, that's not something I was used to in Boulder, Colorado. So that they did have a different value system. And I don't think that periodontal gum care was the highest on their list. It is the highest on my list, but not on theirs.
Do you recall any individuals or families in particular that stood out to you?
I became friends with a couple of them, yes, who for selfish reasons chose to keep them as patients versus sending them over to other dentists. And one of my favorites was Zina. Zina Landman was one of my favorites. And as I recall, she was a physician in Russia, but was not allowed to practice here, would have had to go back to school, and so had to do less than, that level of job in our country, and but was just a lovely lady, and I enjoyed her sense of humor. I saw things. I recall one experience of seeing a young boy in my office with a bite mark on his face, and in fact documented it, but became aware that that was in some way a level of discipline in their society. And their meaning not necessarily Jewish, but probably Russian, or maybe Russian Jewish, but it was an uncomfortable experience for me, seeing that.
You mean that was a form of punishment?
Or discipline, yes. Yes. And of course, one of the things that I went through in those days was you would have to have an interpreter there. When you're talking about to the patient and trying to instruct them, of course it had to go through a third party. Not many of them spoke English, as I recall, but some of them did. So confronting parents, in that particular issue was a very uncomfortable session. I did not call social services because it did not repeat. I saw the kid again. It had never repeated, but anyway.
What was the response when you brought that up to them?
I don't recall, but I want to say that they did not find it unusual, which is then became where I became aware that this is a normal practice. And there was probably a lot of normal practices for them in Russia that we would frown upon in our society. That was one of them.
Could you talk a little bit more about the language barrier and what that was like, trying to communicate through translators?
Yeah, because there was a couple times when there was no translator. So as a dentist, you learn to use sign language to open, to close, to try and, does anything hurt? But that certainly is a barrier, because I don't know what the interpreter was getting from me, and at times using even basic dental terms may not necessarily have gotten across. But we were not there, if we were to instruct on brushing or to inquire about dental pain or dental experiences, we weren't there to do a whole lot of investigation. Again, we were just a triage unit for the most part. After that, when I did establish some relationships, long-term relationships, those people started speaking English, or they did have an interpreter that we also developed relationships with. So how it all played out, I don't know what they got out of it, the patient itself.
Tell us a little bit more about those long-term relationships that you made. What were those relationships like?
Like any relationship, you talk about who you are growing up. I didn't talk about the Brooklyn Dodgers or anything on a sports nature. But maybe some of it was probably tainted by my mother, because I always heard that why my family came over from Russia a gajillion years back was because we were persecuted. So I heard stories of that nature. I can't get into what was done to those people. I don't remember that. But that's what I would talk about. I would talk about their education, a lot about that. What education was like in Russia, and jobs, what their jobs were in Russia.
And what was your impression of them, of their education, of their ideas about education and jobs? And
again, that one was tainted by the fear of the 50s and 60s, when you thought Russia was, when we were growing up as kids, we thought Russia was way powerful and way scary, and that they were a very powerful people. I started learning from talking to them, and then of course what we found out in news media, through the 60s and 70s and 80s, they weren't as up to date in a lot of their approaches. On the other hand, when I would do some dental work on some of them and go into certain teeth, you find things that that just weren't of proper practice within our country. Did some of those procedures, some of the materials that they used, did they work? Yeah, they worked for probably a good long time. In our country, there might have been litigation associated with some of the materials that they used, because I think that I got a feeling there was some toxic materials put in people's mouths. And I don't perceive that to be just because they were, taken advantage because they were Jewish. I think that was common practice in Russia. So.
Now, what was your impression of the Soviet Jewish emigres as Jews?
I didn't get the feeling that they were strongly connected to their Jewish culture. Mm-hmm. I didn't get that sense. I did see some of them in synagogue. Not very many, but I did see some. I just never got that sense, whether it was from my conversations with them, but again, often through interpreters. I guess I'd just leave it at that. I didn't get a sense that they identified a whole lot with their Jewish culture.
Did you get the sense that they maybe began to once they got here?
I can't comment on that. I don't know on that one.
And then, I guess, through your interactions with them, did it change or alter your understanding of your own Jewishness in any way?
No. No. Sorry. No. Remember, again, my mother had instilled that notion in me, that idea that we were we were persecuted as Jews in Russia. The pogroms, were to be feared, and we ran from them. And that's why we were here in the United States. So these people probably experienced, I always get the impression, something of a similar nature. Certainly some, they were outcasts to some degree, whether they were persecuted. Like I had always heard, I don't know. So identified with them on that level, that, another bunch of Jews who were chased out of another country. But that was the extent of, the way I would identify with them and their Jewishness.
Mm-hmm. And how did sort of the incorporation of this community of Soviet Jews into the Boulder community, what effect did that have on the Boulder Jewish community?
I can't, I don't know.
You don't know?
That one's not, I wasn't particularly or very connected to the, I was connected through the synagogue, but that was still rather limited. So I don't have an answer for that one. And these folks, I thought, dispersed. They went to Louisville, Lafayette, Longmont. As any group of people coming to this country would disperse. Mm-hmm. So they didn't all hang out in Boulder, was my understanding.
Mm-hmm. Were your activities limited to dentist work when you were working with BASJ, or did you take part in any of the other?
Just dentistry. That's all it was. And I had, a couple of phone conversations with Bill Cohen, but that was the extent of it. Mm-hmm. That was the extent of it.
Right. And you were involved with BASJ throughout its entire existence?
I can't tell you that because I don't remember when, they stopped sending me patients to examine. I can't tell you that it went on, or if somebody else got involved on a dental level, but so I don't know if that's the case.
I guess then when did your involvement in the group sort of wane?
I don't remember what year that might have been, but I want to say that it was only several years that we were involved with the group. Mm-hmm. That's all that I can recall.
And then I guess one of my last questions is, what sort of, if any, lasting impact did your involvement in this group have on you?
That's something that I would have to sit and think for a while. I guess what comes to mind is always my liberal upbringing of trying to help people who don't have as much, and I still do that. I work on a reservation now, but it was always just to help people, and that was, I guess now what starts coming to mind for me. This could sound awful. Was I love helping people who just need basic help. Get me out of pain. I love that I work on a reservation now where it's not about cosmetics, it's not about luxuries, it's about nitty-gritty, get me out of pain, just can you help me? And that reinforced that experience was just helping those people for basic dentistry and just caring for people on that level, as opposed to Greater Smile Dentistry USA, which is what has taken over dentistry. Mm-hmm. So that just reinforced me the joy that I get out of that.
Mm-hmm. Questions. I guess, how did you get involved with the reservation?
It was just a dream that I had one day, and that when I sold my practice in Boulder, I answered something that was in the Dental Association magazine, and I've been working for the Navajo for 3 years now.
And then, Are you still treating any of your Soviet Jewish clients?
No, I sold my practice here in town,
Oh, okay.
so I'm not involved in dentistry in Boulder at all.
Okay.
I only work for the Navajo.
When did you sell your practice?
5 years ago.
5 years ago.
Yeah.
And you worked for the Navajo since?
For 3 of the years, I've worked for the Navajo and fly out again on Saturday morning to go work down there. Yeah.
But then did you continue to work with your Soviet Jewish clients until you closed your practice?
The few that I kept as patients, again, I tried to disperse most of them to different dentists who accepted them. But yes, I had them still as clients.
That's the majority of my questions. Are there any other anecdotes from your time working with the Soviet Jewish emigres or working with BASJ, or any other stories that you'd like to share?
You know, I guess what just resonated with me when I was talking about this last subject matter was, you know, that I think that auxiliaries need to be recognized too. You know, as staff who stayed and took care of these folks at lunchtimes, didn't get paid for that, lunch, but volunteered to help these people, and I think that's what needs to come out of, you know, one of the critical points that needs to come out of what probably transpired in those years, with that there is a large community of people who are very ready to give of themselves, and I thought it was pretty cool of my staff to do that too. So there's lots of folks, not just the doctors, who help them.
Any other thoughts?
No. Was it?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.